Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the Rosenstiel School of Marine, Atmospheric, and Earth Science for our second year of the Climate Café series. We're pleased to have you join us here in person today and welcome all of our guests that are joining us via Zoom. We have alumni, scholars from other institutions around the state and country, resilience officers, and stakeholders from many counties in Florida joining us online today. So welcome everyone. This year, our series is a two-part program highlighting the podcast A Bright Lit Place, reported by Jenny Staletovich, environment reporter for WLRN NPR Miami. The podcast was supported by the Pulitzer Center. Our Climate Café series is intended to highlight not only the Rosenstiel School's ongoing multidisciplinary climate science research, but the many collaborators and stakeholders working to further our knowledge and find solutions for strategies to adapt to a changing climate. As you know, these types of events don't happen without the support of engaged and dedicated donors. We would like to take a moment to thank our Climate Café sponsors. Our presenting sponsor, William J. Galway III. Bill has been a friend and supporter of our school for nearly 10 years. He has supported and continues to support our Sea Secrets lecture series, which will kick off again in January of 2025. He was a major sponsor of our 2020 Miami Climate Symposium, and we're very grateful for his ongoing support. As an attorney who has practiced law in South Florida for many years, Bill is one of those people that truly cares about the environment, people, and furthering our awareness about issues like climate change. Bill, please stand up. We're also very grateful for a new sponsor, Self-Help Credit Union. You may have seen their QR codes on the reception table, and Sam Chesser. Sam and Self-Help Credit Union's mission is creating and protecting ownership and economic opportunity for all, especially people of color, women, rural residents, and low-wealth families and communities. Sam joined us as an attendee last year. Look what happens, and now he's a sponsor. So thank you very much for that. We really appreciate your support. Another special thanks to our supporting sponsor is the Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Studies, also known as CEMAS. And CEMAS is a partnership with NOAA. We are one of 16 centers of excellence across the United States and the Caribbean. The federally supported institute provides research, education, training, and outreach aligned with its mission and promotes the involvement of students and postdoctoral scientists in NOAA-funded research. Emily, please stand up. Emily Becker is the assistant director of CEMAS. Ben Kurtman would have joined us this evening as well. And also, we're really grateful to our media sponsor, our media partner, WLRN NPR in Miami, for their continued collaboration with the Climate Café series. WLRN Radio and Television is committed to being the most trusted source of information and entertainment in South Florida's diverse community. LRN is best known for its award-winning public radio and television programs, complex media enterprise consisting of radio and television stations and educational channels, offering you a variety of high-quality programming. And thank you, WLRN, for being here and helping us do this. So also a special thanks to all the Rosenstiel staff, students, campus safety facilities, all the folks that helped put this event together. It takes a village, so thank you all. Now is a good time to please silence your phones, your watches, and any other device that you may have with you. We really would appreciate that. So without further delay, we're going to get the conversation going, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. But first, before we welcome our panel, we want to take you to the Everglades to get you in the zone for our conversation. So hopefully you're in the zone. Our moderator tonight is none other than one of South Florida's finest environmental reporters, WLRN's Jenny Staletovich. Jenny's been a journalist working in Florida. Many of you know her for nearly 30 years. She's reported on some of the region's major environment stories, including the 2018 devastating red tide and blue-green algae blooms, impacts from climate change, and the Everglades restoration. She's also written about disappearing rare forests, invasive pythons, diseased coral, and a host of other critical issues around the state. Jenny's won several state and national awards, including the Scripps Howard National Journalism Award for Distinguished Service for the First Amendment, Sunshine State Awards, and a National Edward R. Murrow Award for her extensive coverage on the python. Jenny, come on up. Next, please welcome Curtis Esteban Osceola, serves as the Chief of Staff for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. Prior to his work on tribal government, Mr. Osceola worked as an assistant public defender in the Miami-Dade County's Felony Division and as an associate attorney at the Moskowitz Law Firm, where he successfully litigated an opioid mass torts case on behalf of his tribe against the third largest opioid distributor in the United States. He holds a bachelor's of business administration and finance and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Miami. Go Canes. Mr. Osceola's work now involves the supervision of the tribal administration and the management of the tribe's internal and external policy agenda. Welcome. Dr. Thomas Van Lent is a hydrologist and has been working on the Everglades since coming to Florida in 1982 to work for the South Florida Water Management District. He's an expert in the Central and Southern Florida project and particularly its ecological effects. Tom develops and applies hydrological models and works with ecologists, water chemists, and engineers to predict the effects of water management decisions in South Florida. Tom's worked for the South Florida Water Management District, where he co-developed the first computer models of the hydrology of South Florida. He later worked for the National Park Service as a research scientist, pioneering the methods used for assessing ecological effects of changes to Everglades hydrology. He also worked for the Everglades Foundation as a scientist and researcher, representing environmental interests in the myriad of governmental processes related to the Everglades. He's currently the science advisor to the Friends of the Everglades. Tom holds bachelor degrees in civil engineering and in French literature from South Dakota State University, a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Minnesota, and a doctorate in civil and environmental engineering from Stanford University. He's mostly retired and lives with his wife of 45 years, Lois, in Tallahassee. Please join us, Tom, and thank you. Thank you all.
The least educated person on the stage. That was really impressive. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I know a lot is going on in Florida right now. We've really taken a beating over the last few weeks, and a lot of us are thinking about friends and family over on the Gulf Coast, so I appreciate it. Just to tell you a little bit about the podcast in Bright Lit Place. When I started the project, I've been covering the Everglades for 10 years? Wait, when did I start? Not quite 10 years. And I felt like I was losing track and people were losing track of what was promised and where things were. It's a big, sprawling project, time-wise, money-wise, issue-wise. It just can be very confusing. So I wanted to sort it out and just kind of lay out the stakes and do a little bit of a progress report. And these two helped me immensely in figuring things out. I wanted to start with Curtis because as covering it from an environmental lens, I often just looked at the Everglades for water quality, flood control, what was going on with the wildlife, and you tend to overlook that it's the home to people. And so I just want to start with Curtis asking you, now as Chief of Staff, you're involved in a lot of policy and big issues, but once you were a kid, and what kind of was it like? And I have never asked him this question before. I'd warned him in advance that I was going to ask him about growing up and with this background of Everglades.
Sure. I think one of the rewarding things about living in the Everglades and growing up and having family in the Everglades is that you get to be in one of the wild places in the world and see the birds, see the fish, see the gators, see the wind in the sawgrass, to, you know, hear the hawks cry, to, you know, listen to, you know, the spoonbills and the wood stork. I think as Miccosukees, what we really appreciate is just being able to have presence in what we consider to be our sacred land. We're always reminded by our elders that the Everglades saved us from annihilation. When we were pushed down from North Florida during the removal period and the Creek Wars, it was the Everglades, what we call Kahayale, the bright place. It was that bright place that saved us and sheltered us from removal and from destruction. And we were always reminded that, you know, we cannot leave the bright place, that as long as we're there, that our culture and our identity and our language will continue to survive and thrive. And so growing up there is a unique experience compared to, you know, when I meet my peers and colleagues. But I think a lot of indigenous people who live in the environments that they steward and protect have a similar story. And you know, what I've noticed in terms of taking the temperature of Everglades restoration is that there's been more of an insistence to listen to the indigenous people who are on those lands. And I think, you know, based on the projects that are really coming to the fore now, the tribes are being heard, and our input is being integrated into policy making, and we're not just sort of getting a last-minute consultation. It's not just a phone call, a 5-minute phone call. Okay, yeah, we consulted with the Miccosukees. Now it's day one, you know, announcement, hey, we're going to be making a rule. Okay, we're going to have the tribe at the table, and we're going to talk about, you know, what's right for the Everglades. Oh, we're considering what projects to prioritize now. Where's the tribe on this? And so there's more of an insistence to include indigenous voices generally, and I think that that's a good thing. I think that, you know, we've been, I can't say this anymore, but I felt like we were crying at the moon for so long, just saying, you know, listen to us. We know what the land needs. We know what the water needs. But now we're being heard, and we're being considered and listened to and given deference to. So I think we're getting into a better place. I think a few months ago I was at a different gathering regarding water quality, and I said I'm cautiously optimistic. I think I'm more optimistic now than I was even just a few months ago. So.
That is good to hear, and I don't mean to draw you back into the negative stuff, but I know that it was a struggle. That I think we talked a few years ago, and you reminded me that you know, the tribe is entitled to nation consultation, and so I wonder, what did it take to get that?
Well, you know, we've been at it for a very long time. Just being annoying, I guess. You know, when we think about being heard, it's not just you know, oh, yeah, okay, you know, I hear you, and then you know the government goes and does whatever it wants. Being heard is about listening and learning and sharing ideas and integrating those ideas, and you know, it's taken a long time to get the tribe to this place, and I think what has gotten us here, I mean, I always say this, is like we stand on the shoulders of our predecessors. You know, they laid the groundwork. They really just railed against, you know, the institution, different institutions, state governments, federal governments. And now it's kind of like, oh, you know, those natives might know something about the lands that they live on. And we're like, yes, you got it. Okay, now let's talk about how to do it right. And so it's been, you know, it's just been a long time, but it's because our ancestors just were so persistent and kept on delivering that same message. And then now I get to be up here and people, you know, get to say, you know, Curtis is doing great work, but, you know, I'm here because my predecessors laid the groundwork. You know, it's not, you know, I didn't just do it today. You know, it took generations to get here, so.
One of the things we've talked about is the tribe's lawsuit. to insist on water quality and make sure that the water that was being delivered in Everglades restoration met the phosphorus limits and was clean enough. There are people who say that's the worst thing that's ever happened. I've talked to people who say that's the best thing that's ever happened. A judge's hammer is kind of what, had, so you're kind of like leaning back in your seat, but that is one thing I know when we've talked, now you're negotiating, but there was a time where the law was the option. How do you think how do you see that fitting into restoration and how it got to where we are now?
So, like I said before, we were kind of railing against institutions, different agencies and decision makers, talking to people in Congress. But our voice wasn't carrying as well as it does today. And so, like so many people do, we went to the courts as a place of last resort. Courts tend to be, very text-based and data-based and research-based when they're considering, things like environmental issues. But we had to file that lawsuit to protect our rights from, at the time, the state of Florida. The state of Florida was trying to, raise the amount of phosphorus that could enter the southern glade, the central and southern glades.
Right, and they had pushed back the deadline for meeting the limit. Right,
and we had our own, through our exercise of Clean Water Act standards, we set our own standard at 10 parts per billion, and we sued the state and the agencies, and then there was the joinder of a number of parties, dozens of parties that were interested in the outcomes, and related to endangered species, related to water quality, related to delivery of water in terms of volume. And we had to do that in order to basically hold the state to its duty under federal law, and to hold them to our standard, which we believe to be the right standard. I mean, we know that the Everglades is an oligotropic environment, that the water there is low nutrient, and so we were insistent, and we had scientists and biologists and hydrologists that were informing our policy that advised us that we need to keep it as low as possible. And so when people say, maybe it's the worst thing that ever happened, it's because, well, they had to do a lot more work. And I don't envy that kind of work, because then it's like, okay, how do we solve the problem of water quality in the Everglades, which is one of the main problems. Water delivery is one part of it. Decompartmentalization of the whole system is another. But then water quality is a very important component to sustain that ecosystem. And we had to go to the court as a method of last resort. And fortunately, I think Judge Moreno made the helped us navigate to the water consent decree, and it's one of the oldest consent decrees, if not the oldest consent decree in the United States right now. But we're hopeful that the relationships that we've built all along the way, and the kind of collaborative spirit that we've fostered in recent years will make it so that we don't need that consent decree anymore, that we can work as partners, not as adversaries.
So now I'm going to turn to Tom, and you're not off the hook yet, though. And just, Tom, I feel like you were at the Water Management District in the late 1980s, so my project focused on the 2000 Comprehensive Plan. Tom predated that and was around when things were just sort of getting started. So could you set the stage a little bit in the 1980s? What was going on? Bob Graham, you can start the clock for Everglades restoration in a couple of different places. We talked about this beforehand. Some people might say, well, the formation of Everglades National Park was the beginnings. I think you were putting it at a different place, but I'll let you go now.
Well, I think it's, the beginning is kind of concomitant with the establishment of Everglades National Park, and that was the passage of the Flood Control Act of 1948 that set up the Central and South Florida Flood Control Project. That's the basis of the water management system we have in South Florida today. And there's a whole story to that. That's a great fun. But fundamentally, what the Corps did in 1948 was the Everglades was a river that flowed from Lake Okeechobee, kind of through the middle of the state in the Everglades, and then emptied into the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf and Florida Bay. And much like they did across the country, they took this river and they built a series of lakes and dams. That was the flood control approach. They learned in the 1930s from Mississippi, Missouri, Columbia, Colorado, and you name it, that's what they were busy doing. And they did it here in South Florida. It wasn't until the system started getting built, about 1965 to 1970, that I think there was a recognition that something is desperately wrong. Fish and wildlife populations collapsed throughout the Everglades. There was no water going into Everglades National Park, hearings in Congress, and they kind of said this really wasn't what we had in mind. And there was some, people out there saying, we got to fix this. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was one. She had, in the 1940s, actually endorsed this plan because it was supposed to fix all the problems. They promised everything to everybody. You want fish, wildlife, flood control, water supply. This project is going to do it all. Believe me. It didn't. It did a great job on flood control and water supply, but ecological collapse was not in the intention. So there were people who were pushing this, and that's when I kind of got here, when we got to do something, but the agencies, the Water Management Corps, were not really all that interested in this. I remember going to meetings early in the 1980s where I was called, and the executive director of the South Florida Water Management would say, well, I got a call from the governor. He wants us to do something. So what can we do to kind of look like we're doing something, but, keep the status quo? And it's a kind of interesting story. We came up with this idea of right near C-111, right as you go into the Keys, there's a little bridge right before the South Dade Marina. And that's the canal called C-111. And when they dug that, they just piled the dirt up. Well, our idea was to kind of scooch some of that dirt out. And that way, the water could go into Everglades National Park. That was kind of the concept of what Everglades restoration meant. Scooch some dirt around. They did that. The governor brought Marjorie Stoneman Douglas out to this levee. They went through the whole spiel of how this was such a great benefit to the park. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas turned to the governor and said, not good enough, Bob. Hopped in the helicopter, didn't say a word. Well, apparently the call from the governor to the head of the Water Management District kind of made it clear the governor's serious. He wants something done. The agencies have to respond. At least the state agency. And that was the genesis of the Kissimmee River restoration. That's something we can do. And as that built, the pressure was on the Corps to fix things. It kept going to Congress and getting studies. Most of them didn't do anything. Well, they finally, in 1996, Congress told the Corps to come up with a plan to fix it, basically. And that's the restudy, which became the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. So,
and just so people understand, so beforehand, though, the Kissimmee River restoration and the bottom of the system, Bob Graham had identified, we're going to unplug these canals down in the south, we're going to rechannel or unchannel.
Governor Graham didn't have specifics.
Okay.
He didn't say, I want you to do X, Y, and Z. He said, I want to make the Everglades look more like it did 100 years ago than it does today. I want you to, and we call that Everglades Restoration, but that was his Save Our Everglades, Save Our Rivers Act, or projects, and it was an attempt to at least environmentally bring back what we lost from these projects. The recognition that that wasn't the goal, to destroy South Florida's ecology, but that was the result. So, if you think about it, it was because we took a river and converted it to lakes. So everything that was dependent on the river, well, it wasn't there. Alligator nesting, wading bird nesting, all these keystone processes and species were lost by this new water management regime.
And just one of the things, Curtis, was the tree islands. I mean, I spent some time with one of the tribal elders who grew up on a tree island, and it's underwater now. I don't want to not mention that.
Yeah, the tree islands, at least for us in terms of traditional ecological knowledge, which is a kind of hip term right now that the feds are using to integrate tribal knowledge, but we've utilized it as a tool. But in our traditional ecological knowledge, we look at the tree islands as a barometer for the health of the Everglades. So when the tree islands are healthy and they have hardwood hammocks and their land base is expanding, or I should say at least sustaining, we're not having peat erosion, we're not having hardwood death. We look at that as a good, as a healthy Everglades. But since the flood control project, the Central and Southern Florida flood control project was begun, we've lost 70% of landmass of tree islands. And so now now we're working with the state and federal government to come up with a plan on how to rehabilitate those tree islands as part of Everglades restoration, in concert with restoration plans and projects like Western Everglades restoration. So.
Unfortunately, it's not just tree islands that suffered. In some places where the lake is too deep, the tree islands are drowned with too much water. In other places that were cut off from water, fires burned not just the tree islands, but the soil itself. It's not uncommon to lose 1,000 years of accretion of soil in one massive fire. And these fires have been going on since the 1920s and 30s. So that's what the Central and South Florida project wrought for the Everglades. We've lost massive soil, we've lost tree islands, we've lost wildlife populations. It was, I think it's universally acknowledged this was a catastrophe, and the comprehensive Everglades restoration project was, much like the CNSF project before, touted as the fix. We're going to roll back the clock. And that's kind of where the impetus came. It was from a widespread recognition that there is a lot wrong in the Everglades.
So you were there during the planning. You went to grads or got your Ph.D. and then came
back just in time for the planning, yeah.
But I just wonder, how do you plan something like that? I mean, how?
Well, there's a book there. It was very interesting because the premise of this whole project was you can't change anything about flood control or water supply. Those are guaranteed to people. We can only work on fixing the problems on the environment so long as we don't affect anybody else or any other element of the project. So that was a constraint. That was the sideboards you had to work with. Next was that there wasn't uniform agreement among the scientists and engineers working on what needed to be done. For example, there was a huge debate in these processes and this design of these projects whether or not you had to put the river back, make it flow like it used to, or at least close. And there were kind of two camps. One is, we've known about this since the 1930s. The Everglades is a river. We need to put the river back, and that's how to fix the Everglades. Another group of scientists and engineers said, no, I don't know of any birds who care about the direction of flow. They only care about whether there's fish. So we don't really need to restore the river. We just need to have it look like, kind of like it, or manipulate it like a river. That latter kind of won the day. It was controversial, and then later on we asked the National Academy to come in, and they kind of said, yeah, you need to restore the river. But in the meantime, the plan was fixed. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan kind of changes the operations and does some removing of the dams, but fundamentally it's the same plan the Corps came up with in 1948, but it's got some tweaks to it. And it still is kind of an important question today, how much of that river do we need to put back? I personally think we need a lot more than we're doing now, and we need to keep at it.
Well, and the plan laid out amounts of water, but that getting that much water back down there with all the population and all the sort of obstacles in the way just gets harder. I feel like the longer time goes on, this plan is now 23 years old, the more stakeholders.
Fundamentally, what's happening is that when you build something and it changes, there are people who like the things that it changed into. And in a democratic process, they have a voice, and they should have a voice. So the second thing is that the way the Corps of Engineers does water projects is a legacy from the 1920s and 30s. They do little, small, incremental steps. They don't have a process where they look at whole, great, big, sweeping changes and then add to it as we go. Each individual component or element has to go to Congress, get authorized, and there were 68 projects, individual little pieces that you had to do Everglades restoration. We're 20-some years in, 24 years in, and we're not close to doing all the pieces. So there was the two things. One is just, it's a clumsy process that's not well suited to a project, something as complicated as Everglades restoration. Kind of brings me to, I wonder, we don't have the tools to deal with climate change either. And the Everglades was kind of our first test, and realized that we not only just need new engineering fixes, we need new legal fixes. We need some better ways of involving people in our process. There's a lot we need to do, but you can't keep everything the same and still do restoration. And there's always objections to some specific change you make.
How would you change the plan, like both of you? What would you do differently? I mean, I don't know how old you are. You may be younger than when it was first started, but what things are going better now, but we've lost a lot of ground. I wonder, A, what you think the tribe has lost because it's taken so long, and B, is there a better way to have done this?
We lost time. So it's hard to value time. We're grateful and I think hopeful that we're not too late to restore the Everglades, but we lost a lot of time. And so the question is, are we pivoting soon enough? Like, are we slowing the train down soon enough before it goes off the edge of the cliff? I don't know that I know that answer, but I do know that we are moving in the right direction now than we were, for the previous 60 years before SERP, and even the first 20. You know, I think now there's an insistence and an urgency that wasn't there before. And, you know, we're seeing it now, and not to, you know, invoke, you know, the kind of, you know, trauma that it incurs, but like Hurricanes Milton and Helene and, you know, Hurricane Michael and all these, Hurricane Ian, and you see all these storms, these extreme storms that were, you know, that are coming through the state, inundating the middle of it with water, you know, putting the lake at extremely high levels, you know, in the Hoover Dike. You know, we see it, and now we're kind of like, wait, this is a real problem. We're not doing things fast enough, and I think there's an urgency within the policymakers, you know, within their offices, in their home districts, where they understand how critical it is to South Florida that we restore these lands. So, what I would change, what I would like to change, sort of a boy's dream, is I wish we had more time, but I think what we really would like to see is that continued urgency and that attention to these projects and that continued support. You know, I mean, from my perspective, it's been bipartisan. Everyone understands this is the largest experiment on the face of the earth, science experiment on the face of the earth, and you know, we have to commit. We have to double down on it if we even hope to get it right. So that's where I think we can continue to change in a positive way.
Tom?
Wow. I think I'd look at this from kind of two angles. One is just how would I fix the plan? And as a scientist, one of my heroes of the day was a hydrologist named Gerald Parker, who was out in the Everglades in the 1930s in the back of a mule mapping how the water flowed. It's amazing. We have to put the flow back. We have to restore the river. Keeping it a series of lakes and dams is not going to work. And that means you really have to put a lot of flow. The recent research on flow in the Everglades, it's not just the fact that water is moving, but it's the fact that some years you have like Helene kind of rains, and it just moves a lot of water, and that's responsible for the landscape and the topography of the Everglades. So the science is telling us that, and I think the common sense is telling us that. So I would focus on the River of Grass. The issue there is always going to be the Everglades agricultural area. Next thing I do is, the plan was so constrained at the outset. Just fix the CNSF project. But remember, that plan was developed in 1948 for 1948 Florida. In 1948, we had the population of Arkansas, and we aspired to be like Kentucky. Really, sir, that was the planning model, was can we have an economy the size of Kentucky? Well, 2024, we're the third largest state in the union. Our economy looks nothing like it did in 1948, and we need projects. And the challenges we faced there was just, why do I build a project that supports agriculture? And the whole CNSF project was designed to drain every bit of agriculturally viable land. That was the challenge. In 2024, it's climate change. It's many of the things, this is a great conversation, because those are the challenges we face. We have a water management system that's up to those challenges. And it's going to take more than just SERP. It's going to take more than just fixing the river. We have to rethink our approach to water management in South Florida if we are going to be here in 25, 40, 50 years. Not just the Everglades, but people. And so I think if I was changing, I would start working right now on creating those elements for water management, technical and organizational, that we need to address this. For just one example, all water in the state of Florida is owned by the state, and you use it through a permit for consumptive use. Well, as temperatures increase, agricultural water demand goes up, evapotranspiration. But in Florida, all of our models for how much water you need just give water to ag based upon their irrigation demand. So they had a locked-in increase, whereas urban areas don't. And most of the economy and people are connected to the urban areas. We have to rethink how we're just allocating water. And so if I was to say, looking ahead, we need to start thinking now about changing our approach to water management to deal with the problems of the future, not just to fix the problems we created in 1948.
And so the National Academy, since I think 2016, has been calling for a mid-course correction to deal with climate change. And I think the Biscayne Bay project is the first one to include different sea level rise scenarios that sort of address climate change. But the program-wide adjustment has not been done. What does that mean?
Well, the decision was in 2000, when we were developing the plan, to not include climate change. That was one of the scientific debates. And the justification was, you know what? We can't solve all problems with this one vehicle. That's mission creep. We have enough to do just to restore the ecology. Okay. Kind of begs the question of, so when are we going to get to that climate change part? And I think that's a kind of a whole different question, but SERP just decided to not include it. But in one project in Miami-Dade County called the Biscayne Bay and Southern Everglades Ecosystem Restoration Project, if you drive out of Homestead toward the Keys along US 1, you see marshes on both sides, and that project is intended to restore that. Well, in the lifetime of a project, we expect that area to be inundated. So it doesn't make sense to build a lot of projects or infrastructure in areas you know are going to be inundated in 30, 40 years. So that project had to include that element, but other projects that could easily be take into account climate change really haven't got there, because that's not part of the task that was assigned to the Everglades Restoration Project.
And not including changing rainfall patterns, drought patterns.
Don't get me started, yeah.
The system is based.
Yeah, we're all going to be right in the thick of the effects of climate change. So we were talking about Everglades restoration, but Everglades was shaped in a time of rising sea levels. The Everglades has some, for lack of a better word, I don't mean to anthropomorphize the Everglades, but it's got defense mechanisms. It can build soil if you keep it wet, if you keep the mangroves healthy. We maybe can't stop sea level rise, but we can stop some of the more damaging effects in the Everglades, or at least control them. But you have to plan for those things. You have to start thinking about it now, and there are some programs, I would say, that are trying to address water management and sea level rise. But, for example, most of them involve just putting pumps at the coastal structures and pumping water out directly into Biscayne Bay or the intercoastal waterways. We might need a more comprehensive approach than that. Is that a good idea? Use diesel-fired pumps to do that. I mean, we do need in this state a lot more, I would say, water management planning and infrastructure to help us cope with our future. My family is going to stay here. I hope. Hope to see the tribe. You know, it's as you said, part of their religion. As long as the Everglades exist, your people exist. We have to do this. We have to address these issues, and delaying doesn't help.
So I want to give time for questions. There we go. Okay. Do you have a microphone? Or
let me borrow one of yours, and you guys can share. Sure. Real quick, before we get into the Q&A, I just want to remind you to join us for part 2, shameless promo, on November 13th for part 2 of the discussion, which will talk about the future. Where do we go from here? Hands? There's Dr. Stoddard. Good to see you.
Thank you. I really appreciated the 10,000-foot flyover. I have a more prosaic question. I hope I'm not opening a can of worms here, but you guys already opened it for me, so I figured I can just waltz in. Let's suppose that the modelers are right, and this new combination reservoir cleaning marsh system doesn't hit the 10 part per billion phosphorus target, which seems pretty likely. I mean, I don't see how it possibly could. I'm presuming then that what we'll wind up with is a patchwork of water. Some water is clean enough to release south. Some waters, possibly the majority of water, is not. My question is, what happens? Do they let the trickle of clean water south and they keep pushing the dirty water out the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie? It's not going to stay there, it can't. What happens when this goes off the rails?
I feel like that's a hydrologist question.
I was going to say it's
Well, you first.
It's hydrology and it's law, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Stoddard, it is both. As I think there's a general consensus among scientists is you can't restore the Everglades with polluted water. All you're doing is delaying slowing down the damage, but it's got to be clean. It's got to meet water quality standards. So the question, I think, really is legal. And I don't mean to just put Eric on the spot, but it really is. What do you do?
It's all right. I used to practice in Judge Hirsch's courtroom, so I'm used to being on the spot. Well, then you have to respond, right? If the policy doesn't match what's on the ground, then you have to change it. You know, you can't just have policy inconsistent with the real world. That's the kind of thing that creates projects like the Central and Southern Flooding Control Project, you know? The reality is, if we're seeing, I mean, we already are seeing these elevated phosphorus levels. You know, our hydrologists and water managers at the tribe, you know, we have 187,000 acres of leased lands that is called the Water Conservation Area 3A, where we call it the Miccosukee Conservation Area. But that's where our ancestral tree islands are, right? We're already seeing, you know, out of the L28 and L28 interceptor canals, over 100 parts per billion during rain events. And at certain junctions of it, 300 parts per billion. And Western Everglades restoration, I mentioned the project earlier, but it's to partially address that kind of main line into tribal lands that's just dumping agricultural runoff onto our lands. We have a 6,500 acre plume of invasive and exotic tree species and plant species like cattails, like willows, that are terraforming that area, and it grows exponentially like a nautilus each year. And we're trying to address that, and we're gonna have to mitigate that. What happens when we mitigate it? We're gonna unsettle a lot of sediment that has nutrients in it. and all that stuff's going to move south. So what happens? The real world is going to hit us in the face. The reality of it is that we're, either we move dirty water through a pristine ecosystem because we have to, or else the coast will be, we'll have to deal with red tide, the river, the riparian communities will have to deal with blue-green algae, and, the lake will continue to be, a barren wasteland for aquatic life. Or we get serious about changing the way we do agriculture in Florida. I don't know what it is about Florida that we think that we have to use too much nutrients to grow our crops. I mean, we see it. There's responsible ag at least being attempted on the Ohio River, where the load in is not is reducing runoff out. But we don't do that in Florida for whatever reason. And I think it's because we have a pretty robust agricultural lobby and a pretty friendly legislature to agriculture. And I'm not saying it's got to go away, but it's got to be more responsible. We got to come to the table and do it right. We can't continue to just keep dumping nutrients and loading up these sediments. But to your question, those are the two choices. Either we adjust policy to move dirty water through a pristine ecosystem, or maybe we have to do both, right? Either we move that dirty water through, or we get serious about changing our practices.
Have you stacked up your legal strategy yet?
That's
Not asking you what it is, just one question.
that's privileged.
We have another question over here.
I think I'll open a can of worms. I've seen the changes in Shark Valley and the loss of the small animals. I understand that about 1923, somebody blasted away along the top of the Miami River and let the Everglades flow out to sea. I've been to the sugarcane fields south of Okeechobee, and they claim that they cut back on certain nutrients because of the effluent. And you mentioned big agriculture, and it's actually big churches too, that have 3 million or 4 million cows north of Okeechobee, dumping 180 million pounds of waste every day. So all the lagoons that you make, how do you stop that without cutting back on the number of cattle up there? I mean, it's vast. I've seen wild boar and millions of cows that come in by train and truck, and that's big business, and it flows into our watershed.
Yeah. The tribe has been saying for a long time that you can't drain the land and have crops and cattle and all this stuff because you're going to change the way that the world works. You're going to kill the Everglades, you're going to change the land, you're going to change the trees, you're going to change it forever. We've been saying that ever since they started, really in the late 1800s in North Florida when they built the Kissimmee Canal. That restoration project to fix that, I mean, that helps. But you're right. I mean, all you have to, I don't know if any of you have ever tried to fish in Lake Okeechobee, but it is barren. And our stories, Lake Okeechobee used to be this massive, massive lake. I mean, bigger than it is today, almost twice the area, because of, it was a free lake, and so it depended on the amount of rainfall that came in, that how big the lake was. The shoreline was riparian. It would expand and contract like a beating heart. And, and you said earlier we shouldn't anthropomorphize the Everglades, but I think we should. I mean, the tribe does all the time. And maybe, there's context and situations to do that in. Maybe this isn't it. But, from the tribe's perspective, right, it's our mother. It is a living being. It is a living thing. It is a massive ecosystem that touches every part of the state, virtually every part of the state, but certainly the entire peninsula. And when you talk about agriculture and you talk about what we're doing to the state, we need to get wise about our practices. And we need to, be realistic about whether or not we're serious about restoring the glades and keeping the nutrients out.
I've seen the huge valves for water treatment district way north. I've seen the huge valves. I mean, they're huge. And the story is, if the cows up north of Okeechobee start getting fungus in their hooves, they open the valves, and then the deer in farther south near Shark Valley, they get the fungus. I mean, that's water management around the cattle, not around the people.
We have another question over here.
First of all, thank you for this seminar. Very, very interesting. My question is, you both spoke about the effects of federal government and state government and the controls that they have and the responsibilities that they have and the impacts that they're having in the past on the Everglades and now. What about the county? Here in Miami-Dade County, the UBD, urban boundary line, and expanding that, a lot of times local government has a lot more impact on the ecosystems and the surroundings than, at the federal and state level. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the county impact and county responsibility.
Yeah, I think as stakeholders in Miami-Dade County, right? I mean, we have multiple commissioners. We have Anthony Rodriguez. At least now we have Anthony Rodriguez. We have J.C. Bermudez, and we also work with Mr. Gonzalez, Roberto Gonzalez, and we're all trying to figure out, what the future looks like in terms of environmental protection. I mean, you have a commission that has a housing crisis. You have people on the ground that are telling you, please don't harm the Pensuco wetlands. Please keep the UDB alive. But, it is a political question, right? Like, what is the county going to do? Is it going to cow to the development? Is it going to expand our footprint of human life into a wetland, or are we going to double down and protect those wetlands? That's a voter question. That's a commission question, and for us, for the tribe, we've continued. We've always supported the county in its environmental restorative efforts. But that changes with politics and it changes with administrations. We've been here the whole time saying don't do it. We're just hoping you guys listen to us.
We have another question over here, but shameless promo number 2. This afternoon I got an email. Mayor Cava will join us for part 2, so you can ask some of those questions then.
First of all, thank you guys so much. I really do appreciate you guys coming together and giving such a great perspective on Everglades restoration. So about 3 nights ago, I was doing what most sane human beings do. I was walking across the Taylor Slough, which is, for those who don't know, one of the main sloughs of the Everglades ecosystem. And I saw a very broadleaf tree that I didn't want to see there, and that was a red mangrove. A red mangrove being one of the most primary coastal mangrove species, and kind of our first line of defense against storms and coastal erosion. And the thought crossed my mind, is it nature that's unprepared for this? The number we hear, the projection we hear is 3 feet by 2100 of sea level rise. Is it nature that's not ready for this, or is it us? And what I want to ask is, if nature really is ready for this sort of thing, and Everglades is in and of itself, inundately, just this ephemeral system that's always adapting to fluctuations, how do we inspire paradigm shifts in our society that allow us to kind of think more holistically about how we exist in the footprint of the Everglades, as opposed to just these loose-ended, non-considering plans that currently exist? I do applaud SERP for the advances it has made, but there just is a lot more to what could happen with the future of sea level rise. So yeah, my point is that nature has it figured out. We don't. What do we do about it?
How much time you got?
Too much.
I think you answered it. You said the way that the world works has to change. You just said that a few seconds ago, and that's what it has to be.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's from the tribe's perspective, right? From our, I guess, cultural perspective. The world has changed before. It will continue to do so. We subsist on it, but the world's going to change whether we like it or not. I'm talking about the environment, right? I mean, we as people, it's a different question, right? I mean, it's inconvenient to think that we have to, change the way we live our lives, and the way that agriculture does business, and the way that we, perform water management in the glades and restore. It's expensive, and it's inconvenient, and it's uncomfortable. But the world will always be ready. In our history, this isn't the first go-around for mankind. We've done this before, and the world takes care of itself, and it takes care of us, and then it doesn't when it doesn't want to. The world can be, all you have to do is look at other planets to see how harsh things can be on a world. And, the Earth can do that to us too. So the question is, do we really want to change? Are we going to do that?
We have another
I hope we do.
Well, and Tom answered this. One of the points I raised in the podcast is that Everglades restoration was supposed to slow things down and prepare. Like if we had kept up with it, we would have been in better shape rather than being 23 years behind, maybe not, 23 years behind.
I don't know the answer to that question, because it's like, what happens if you did everything exactly on schedule? We're talking about the government, so that doesn't always seem like the most likely scenario. But I would say two things. First, if you're talking about the natural environment, the Everglades, and you said you noticed red mangrove, well, there are reasons for that, but the real question is, can I put enough water through the system so that it kind of, sea level is a very controlled and gradual process, or we have a lot of evidence that if you just let it go uncontrolled and seawater seeps into freshwater marshes, you have the collapse of the soil. Literally, almost overnight, that drops 3 feet. You don't want that. That's bad. You want a lot of fresh water to maintain these marshes, and so Everglades restoration is the way forward for the natural system. The built environment is going to see even more stresses than the Everglades for climate change and sea level rise. And if you're not seeing that, you're not paying attention. I mean, there's a paper that came out within a week of Hurricane Milton that said that because of the global rise in sea surface temperatures, Milton would have hit as a Category 2 rather than a Category 3. And you can calculate the increase in damages from a 2 to a 3. So if things like that aren't enough for you to say, gosh, we really need to do something, not just for the Everglades, but to save ourselves in Florida, I don't know what more you can do. But that's why I say I do think we need more tools to help us address our future. And I don't know if I have all of them. I have maybe a few ideas on some of the water management, but it's going to be legal. It's going to be social. It's going to be technical. It's going to be scientific. It's the biggest challenge we've faced as a people. And it's going to take all of us and our brains to deal with it. So, but it's happening now.
We have another question back here. We have time for 2 more questions, and then Jenny, I'm going to turn it back to you for some. Oh, we got, okay, as long as you guys want to stay here, that's fine. We'll go a little longer. Okay, here you go.
Hi, thank you all for being here and talking about this today. My question is a broader sweep. It seems as though that there's a roadblock to every fix that has come up, whether it's the phosphorus or politics or agriculture, dirty water. You know, when I sit back and I hear all of this, I'm wondering, is it really even possible to do it? Or is this a pipe dream? Is this our fantasy that we can go back and restore the river with all of these roadblocks? I would love to see it happen. Is there anything also that individually we can do as citizens to aid in that process? If so, please disclose. Thank you.
Yes, it is possible. I learned a long time ago that you have to believe in something for it to come true. Everglades restoration and the problems that come with it, or I should say the issues that come with it, the characters that come with it, the politics that come with it, the money that's in it and around it, and the interests that compete. You know, in my intro, right, we talked about how I helped litigate an opioid case for my tribe, right? And I thought that was complicated. You know, 5 million documents and you know, reams and reams of data and analysis and trying to figure out, you know, what damages are, legal question. I thought that was the most difficult problem I would ever see in my life until I came to work at the tribe again in my current role. And I figured out quickly that Everglades restoration is the single most intractable problem on the face of the earth. But it's because it's a very human problem. I think if we hadn't, you know, hamstrung the Everglades, we wouldn't have to have these panels and these discussions. We wouldn't have to, you know, if Miami wasn't here and there wasn't, you know, millions and millions of people in the state of Florida, we wouldn't have to deal with the problem. But that's the reality. That's where we are today. But I do think it's possible. It's just going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of resources. So when you completed your question, you asked, like, well, what can you do? I think you have to advocate for the Glades. And, you know, like the good doctor was saying, you know, we have to unplug the lakes and the dams and the dikes and everything. It has to be a river. And that's got to be the messaging. You know, you heard it here first. SERP 2.0 is a thing that we're all thinking about now, which is how do we finish what we started with SERP?
Over here, Dr. Becker has a question.
Could I?
Tom.
I would, you have to have hope. And I know as a scientist, sometimes you want to keep things kind of on an intellectual, abstract level. But for me personally, and I listened to Curtis talk about growing up in the Everglades, I'm so glad Diana started with that visual of the Everglades. Just go out there and be out there and have a visceral connection with it. And whether that's the Bay or the Everglades or wherever, just know what's at stake and get people to understand. You're surprised how many people who live in Miami who've been to the beach but not the Everglades. Just let them know what's at stake. Share it as a real value. I mean, I used to work on computer models with engineers at the Water Management District in the Corps who'd never been to the Everglades, and they were doing the computer model. And you show them this is what it is. And it changed their perspective. So I think it's one person at a time. Share your values. And that's why it's really important to hear stories like Curtis who say, I grew up here. what does home mean to you? And share that value, because that's what's going to change. And if you want to keep Miami, Key Biscayne, then you better start working on climate change issues, because that's what's at stake.
And I'll just point out that Tom practices what he preaches. He used to go on these long solo paddle trips for days, right? Like, think, what was it, 7 days was the max, or 10 days? You told me at one point that there was a...
I can only carry water. Only carry water for 10 days. So that's, that I deeply envy people who get to live out there. And if it wasn't for the lack of a cold beer every once in a while, I probably would not come back.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to all three of you. This has been eye-opening, fascinating. I have some experience with the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay, and this is orders of magnitude more complicated. So actually, I have a really small question. Curtis, you mentioned decompartmentalization, I think. Can you just tell me what that is?
Yeah, it's what we've, I think, been talking about, is just getting rid of the levees, getting rid of the dams, getting rid of the dikes, and making it a river of grass.
Talk about the water conservation areas, because that's how it's kind of compartmentalized. They're vast areas. The tribe is 3, right?
Yeah, long ago when the earth was young and it was warm shortly after it cooled. No, but seriously, when the Central and Southern Florida Flood Planning Project began, as part of the Flood Control Act, these water conservation areas and water management areas were created to make sure that, you know, drinking water and the water table in Florida was sustainable. And the way that the Corps and the science in the 40s viewed water management was that, well, we just gotta like keep it in a container. And if we keep it in a container, we know how much is there, we know when it's gonna run out, and everything will be fine. But, you know, the Glades was doing just fine on its own. One of my councilmen, Secretary Osceola, he often talks about, in these kinds of discussions, the hubris of man, right? Thinking that we do it better than nature. But we're here today, right? And we have to get it right. And I think getting it right is it's trying to restore it to that more natural state. And that's getting rid of the levees, getting rid of the dams, getting rid of the dikes, and having this, you know, natural sheet flow from Shingle Creek all the way down to Florida Bay. So that's the vision.
You mentioned politics. I think that's a big thing of getting taxes. How much do they pay for the water, the agriculture? Oh. How much do they pay for the water that the farmers are using? My guess is it's heavily subsidized and it's not the same rate that the cities and counties are paying.
Well, this is an interesting question. I would say that under Florida law, so this is kind of a legal question, the state of Florida owns all the water, so you don't really pay for it. You get a permit to use water, so long as there's, in the public interest, there's tests. So if you in the urban areas, you pay for the delivery system, and so it costs more per gallon, but that's not it. But really interesting story. In 1948, well, actually in 1947, there was massive rainfall. A couple of hurricanes. South Florida was underwater. And that was the impetus to a public outcry, do something about the flooding in the Everglades, and that led to the 1948 Flood Control Act. The interesting story is that, well, who pays? The state had to pay about 1/3 of the costs because, for a lot of reasons, but the state had to pay. So who in the state pays? Well, the farmers argued that, well, they had just gone through a flood. They lost all their cattle. Like, they can't pay any taxes. So they fund Everglades, all the water management infrastructure, with a tax on property, an ad valorem tax. So in terms of who pays for water management in South Florida, it's the urban areas. About 90 to 95% of the tax revenue comes from the urban areas, but benefits, there was a proposal to tax benefits, but that all got thrown out the window, and in 1948, ag was just as powerful in the legislature it is today, and they got it all funded by you. Well,
I mean, don't you think it comes down to just in politics, there's winners and losers, and powerful lobbyists versus not so powerful?
And in 1948, the key period when they built the Central and South Florida project, they decided that it was the urban areas that were going to pay for it. That was the decision. If you go to your tax bill and see something called the Everglades construction project, that is the urban areas paying to clean up runoff, the polluted water from the sugarcane fields. So they're also, you're pretty much paying about, well, more than 75% of the cost of cleaning up the agricultural pollution. So yeah, that's just how Florida chooses lots of people in the Lower East Coast, not so many in the ag.
We have I'll let Curtis go ahead and answer, and I just want to let you know we have another question here.
Sure. I heard your question, and I kind of thought of two different things that might be related. Has anyone worked on water policy in the West? Okay. So there's a saying out West that you drink whiskey and you fight over water. And it's because water is so scarce. And so everyone, states, sovereigns are fighting over water. Farmers are fighting over water. Tribes are fighting over water. And it costs millions and millions and millions of dollars just to have access, whether it's legal barriers, permits, things like that, rights, representation of rights. In Florida, we have too much water. So much water that we don't know what to do with it. We want to push it out the rivers, but the river communities obviously don't want blue-green algae blooms, and the coastal communities don't want red tide that follows those releases. So what do we do with it? Well, let's just send it south. Well, guess who's south? The Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Florida. So when we talk about, how much does it cost? It's relatively cheap for ag and for really for anyone that's in a rural area. And it's all rain driven. We don't really have there's some springs in the center of the state, but that's not where the water comes from. It's rain driven for the most part. That's the first part. And then the second part is, when you think about the cost of paying for these restoration projects, there's also, not only is it urban communities in the state, but the federal taxpayers are paying as well. I mean, the water consent decree that we have, right, with the state and the feds and the Corps, we have a cost-sharing agreement. The feds pay half, the state pays half. So everyone who pays federal income taxes is paying for these restoration projects. So, it's expensive. It's very, very expensive. And, we could certainly use that money for better things, but here we are. And I say better things, not that the environment doesn't matter, but just to say, if we did nothing initially, we wouldn't be here, right? But here we are, and so this is an important project. These are important projects, and we have to do more. I think that's the call to action that we all agree on. Is like we can't stop once SERP is complete. We have to keep going.
And I would just argue, too, that we're really paying for pollution control and flood control, because if it was just the water flowing, we could let it flow, but we need to keep it from flooding urbanized areas, and we need to make sure that it's clean. There was the penny a pound sales tax that could have paid for some of the pollution control. Voters voted for it, and then the legislature didn't implement it, and that's what I was getting at when I mentioned lobbyists and sort of powerful industry interests.
So we are going to take this question, one more question here and one down in the audience. They will turn off our AC at 6, and trust me, you don't want to be here past 6. So,
thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for coming through with such knowledge and this evening. I just wanted to ask a question. That climate change does exist, but what happens if climate change is really manipulated? Like for instance, and a lot of people are going to say, oh, she's a conspiracy theorist, and then that's okay. You can think whatever you want. But I know about chemtrails. I see them all the time on our blue skies. So when DeSantis came out as governor for the first time, I called to see if I can have a phone meeting with him to let him know about the chemtrails. So the representative on the other line said to me, this has nothing to do with the state. Those planes have to do with the feds. So my question is, what is it that within the purposes of the Everglades with the lobbyists and with the feds, that they are retrieving all this money, or they say, well, we're going to help you in this, or we're going to, do this and that, but it's really them trying to control the population and the land for what it has.
So I think you identified a few things that I can speak to. When we engage in commerce in general, we burn fuel, right? We're burning fossil fuels. We're putting chemicals in the air, petrochemicals. We're, creating byproducts that are not good for us. I worked in consumer protection and toxic torts for a few years, and we have consumer products out there that are littered with dangerous and hazardous chemicals that end up in multi-district litigation, and they create these funds to help people with medical monitoring. And so I think that what you're identifying is a problem with us, right? We are addicted to a here and now lifestyle that we exhaust a lot of resources for, and you can see it in our ag practices. We're not getting up to date. We're not being responsible. And I think when you talk about government, the question is, are we holding our representatives accountable for the decisions they make? And I think that we need to continue to do that, especially when it comes to Everglades advocacy and environmental protection. So we shouldn't, shirk at the thought, and just say, well, there is this, they're just too powerful, and we can't do anything about it. We can, and that's why we have elections, and we have to hold our leadership accountable for their actions. So that's my take.
One more question over here.
Thank you. Why don't they hold the people who create the problems responsible for fixing the problems, like, for example, Big Sugar? That's one. The other thing is cause and effect. If you do take away all that Army Corps engineer construction and compartmentalize and open up the river again, it's kind of cause and effect. You solve one problem, but then you create another one. So,
yeah, I think my take on that is we've tried in the past to be punitive as a matter of policy to, industries like ag, citrus, cattle, sugar. It doesn't work. They have a lot of money, and money is speech in this country, and they talk a lot, and they talk real loud. So you can't do it that way. That's a Pyrrhic road to travel down. So you might not like my answer, but I think the reality is you have to partner with those individuals. You have to coalition build and include them, and get them to the table to realize that their practices are hurting their bottom line too. And you have to put in the work to make it make sense for them.
Don't they realize their grandkids have to live here too?
That's what I'm kind of getting at. Is you have to make it make sense. And then second of all, the problem we create is a human problem, and we're going to have to get over it.
Wrap us up here. I'm going to let you guys do final wrap up, and we'll.
Yeah, final thoughts.
Final thoughts. I just want to thank you all for coming, and want to especially thank the Rosenstiel School. They've been such a key part of the science side of what goes on in the Everglades. I remember my first trip out here was to meet a computer modeler named John Wang, who's working on this. So, and I think it speaks to what needs to happen. It's this synthesis of informed citizens, scientists, engineers, reporters, the media, all working on this issue. So this was an excellent opportunity to talk about it, and I appreciate it. Thank you, Rosenstiel School.
So I just thank all of you for attending and just listening. In your questions were, I think, cut to the heart of some of the problems we face. And there's some students, I should say. There's I guess a lot of students from RasMaz and who are soon to be UM grads or in grad school. You guys are awesome. So I was in your seat not long ago, and listening to people talk about changing the world, or sometimes not changing the world and sustaining the status quo. And I'd say to you that whatever you're dreaming, whatever you want to accomplish, just go for it. Just no holds barred, go for it, and change the world.
So it is hard to follow that, but I just want to thank the two of you from the bottom of my heart. You were so helpful explaining how the Everglades works for me. Without you, I don't think that story could have been told. It takes a lot of courage to stand up and sometimes say things that not everybody agrees with. You all gave me the straight answers, unafraid to answer. I don't think I asked a single question that either of you said, I can't answer that, or I won't answer that. So I appreciate that, and thank you for coming out today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you here on Wednesday, November 13th for part 2. If you haven't listened to Bright Lit Place, it's never too late. It's very enjoyable and certainly worthy. Thank you so much for joining us.